The lobby of the downtown Grand Hotel had seen thousands of guests come and go, but most of them never really noticed the man sitting at the piano in the corner. His name was David, and for the past 3 years, he'd been part of the furniture. Just like the crystal chandelier overhead or the marble columns that lined the entrance, he was always there, quietly doing his job. Thursday evenings were usually slow. The business travelers were tired from their meetings, the tourists were out exploring the city, and the hotel staff moved through their routines with practiced efficiency. David's fingers moved across the keys almost automatically now. He'd played these songs so many times that his mind could wander while his hands remembered every note. A little Gershwin here, some Chopin there. Maybe a jazz standard if he was feeling adventurous. Nothing too loud, nothing too soft. Just perfect background music for people who weren't really listening. At 42 years old, David had made peace with his life. Sure, this wasn't what he'd imagined when he was younger, studying music in college and dreaming about concert halls filled with people hanging on his every note. But dreams change, life happens, bills need to be paid, and honestly, there was something comfortable about this routine. No pressure, no expectations, no disappointments. He showed up, he played, he went home, simple. The tip jar beside him usually had a few dollars by the end of the night. Sometimes a generous guest would drop in a 20, and David would feel a small spark of appreciation, not for the money itself, but for the acknowledgement that someone had actually heard him, that someone had stopped for just a moment and really listened. Those moments were rare, though. Most nights, he might as well have been a recording. On this particular Thursday in October, the hotel was hosting some kind of corporate event upstairs in the grand ballroom. David could hear the muffled sounds of speeches and laughter filtering down through the ceiling. That meant the lobby was even quieter than usual. Just a few scattered guests sitting on the velvet sofas, scrolling through their phones or reading newspapers. The kind of crowd that made David feel like he was playing for ghosts. He finished a piece and took a sip of water from the bottle he kept hidden beside the piano bench. His back was starting to ache a little. 3 hours into his shift, and he still had 2 more to go. He stretched his fingers and was about to start another song when he noticed her. An older woman, maybe in her 70s, was sitting alone on one of the sofas about 15 feet away. She wasn't looking at her phone, she wasn't reading. Her eyes were closed, and she had the most peaceful expression on her face. David realized she was actually listening to him. Really listening. It was such an unusual sight that he found himself playing a little differently, putting a bit more feeling into the notes. When he finished the piece, he expected her to get up and leave like most people did. But instead, she opened her eyes and smiled at him. Not a polite, passing smile, a real one. The kind of smile that reaches the eyes and seems to say something without words. David smiled back, a little uncertain. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. The woman stood up and walked over to the piano. She moved slowly but with dignity, carrying herself like someone who'd lived a full life and had stories to tell. When she reached the piano, she didn't say anything at first. She just looked at David with kind eyes that seemed to see right through him. "You play beautifully," she finally said. Her voice was soft but clear. "Thank you," David replied, feeling oddly self-conscious. "Just doing my job." "How long have you been playing here?" she asked. 3 years. Almost 4 now, actually." She nodded thoughtfully, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the piano. "You're very skilled. I can tell you've had formal training." David felt something stir inside him, something he'd buried a long time ago. "Yeah, I went to music school. Seems like a lifetime ago now." The woman studied him for a moment, and David had the strange feeling that she could see all the dreams he'd given up on, all the what-ifs he tried not to think about anymore. Then she asked him something that caught him completely off guard. "Would you play something for me? Something you wrote yourself?" David felt his stomach tighten. I just play covers here," Standards. That's what the hotel wants. I know what the hotel wants, she said gently. But I'm asking what you want. Surely you must have written something over the years, something that's yours. David's hands went still on the keys. The truth was, he had written things. Boxes of notebooks sat in his apartment closet, filled with compositions he'd created years ago when he still believed he had something to say. He hadn't looked at them in ages. What was the point? They were just private dreams, scribbled notes that no one would ever hear. I don't know, he said quietly. It's been a really long time. The woman's smile never wavered. Then maybe it's time to remember. There was something about her presence, something about the genuine interest in her eyes that made David want to trust her. Before he could talk himself out of it, he found his hands moving to the keys. Not to play Gershwin or Chopin, but to play something that had lived in his heart for 15 years. It was a piece he'd written after his mother passed away. She'd loved gardening, spent hours tending to her roses and tulips, and David had tried to capture that feeling in music, the peace she found in the soil and sunshine. The way beauty could grow from something as simple as a seed. He'd never played it for anyone before. It felt too personal, too raw. But now, in this quiet hotel lobby, his fingers found the melody like they'd been waiting all this time to let it out. The notes were gentle at first, tentative, like the first flowers of spring. Then they grew stronger, more confident, weaving between sadness and hope in a way that surprised even David. He'd forgotten how much feeling he'd poured into this piece, how much of himself was in every chord. As he played, something strange happened. The few people scattered around the lobby stopped what they were doing. A businessman lowered his phone. A couple paused their conversation. Even the front desk clerk, who'd heard David play 1,000 times, looked up from her computer with a curious expression. The music filled the space in a way David's usual playing never did. It wasn't just background noise anymore. It was alive. It demanded to be heard. When the final note faded away, David sat very still, his hands resting on the keys. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence felt heavy with something David couldn't quite name. Then he heard it. Soft at first, then growing louder. Applause. He looked up and saw that everyone in the lobby was clapping. The businessman, the couple, the desk clerk, a few hotel staff members who'd stopped to listen, and the elderly woman who had tears streaming down her face. David felt his throat tighten. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had reacted to his music like this. But then he noticed something else, someone standing near the elevators, someone he hadn't seen arrive. A woman in an elegant black coat, probably in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun. She was staring at David with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. And she was walking toward the piano with purpose in her steps. The woman in the elegant black coat reached the piano, and David felt his pulse quicken. There was something about the way she carried herself that made him sit up straighter. This wasn't just another hotel guest. She had an air of authority, of someone who was used to being listened to and taken seriously. "Excuse me," she said, her voice crisp but not unkind. "That piece you just played, who wrote it?" David swallowed hard. "I did, a long time ago." The woman's eyes widened slightly, and she exchanged a glance with the elderly woman who was still standing nearby. "Would you mind playing it again? I'd like to hear it properly this time." David's mind was racing. Who was this person? Why did she care? But something in her tone made it clear this wasn't really a request. It was more like an opportunity, and he'd be a fool to pass it up. "Sure," he managed to say. "Of course." This time, as his hands returned to the keys, he was acutely aware of being watched. The woman in the black coat moved closer, standing right beside the piano where she could see his hands. She closed her eyes as he began to play, her head tilted slightly, as if she was analyzing every single note. David tried to focus on the music, on his mother's garden, on the feeling he was trying to capture. But it was hard not to be distracted by the weight of this woman's attention. Still, as the melody flowed, he found himself getting lost in it again. The piece had a life of its own, and all he had to do was let it speak. When he finished, the woman opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression David couldn't quite read. It was somewhere between surprise and satisfaction, like she'd just confirmed something she'd suspected. "My name is Helen," she said, extending her hand. "Helen Tanaka. I'm the conductor of the National Symphony Orchestra." David felt like someone had just knocked the wind out of him. The National Symphony Orchestra. He'd seen their performances advertised on billboards downtown. They were one of the most prestigious orchestras in the country, and their conductor was standing in front of him, shaking his hand. "I'm David," he said stupidly, as if she'd asked. "I play piano here, obviously. You can see that." Helen smiled slightly at his nervousness. "David, I'm going to ask you something that might sound crazy, but I want you to hear me out before you say no." David nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "In 2 weeks, we're holding our annual gala benefit concert. It's our biggest fundraising event of the year. We have major donors coming, critics, music enthusiasts from all over the region. We always try to feature something special, something unexpected." She paused, looking at him intently. "I want you to perform at that concert. Your composition, with the full orchestra." For a moment, David thought he must have misheard her. Or maybe he was dreaming. Maybe he'd fallen asleep at the piano, and this was all some elaborate fantasy his tired brain had cooked up. "I'm sorry, what?" was all he could say. "I want you to perform your music with my orchestra," Helen repeated, speaking more slowly this time. "That piece you just played is extraordinary. It has something real in it, something honest. That's what classical music needs more of, not just technical perfection, but genuine emotion." David let out a laugh that sounded slightly hysterical even to his own ears. "You can't be serious. I'm a hotel pianist. I play background music for people checking in and out. I haven't performed on a real stage in 20 years, maybe more." "I'm completely serious," Helen said, her expression unwavering. "But I don't have anything ready," David protested, his mind spinning with 1,000 reasons why this was impossible. "That piece isn't even orchestrated. It's just a piano composition, and it's just one piece. You'd need a whole program." "Do you have other compositions?" Helen asked. David thought about the notebooks in his closet. "I have some things, but they're just sketches, really, personal projects. Nothing that's ready for something like this." Helen pulled out a business card from her coat pocket and placed it on the piano. "I'm staying at this hotel for 3 more days for a conference. I want you to think about this. Go home, look at your compositions and really consider it. We have arrangers who can help with orchestration. We have 2 weeks, which is tight but doable. What we can't create is what you already have, that authenticity, that emotional core." David picked up the card, his hand trembling slightly. The card was simple and elegant, just her name and contact information embossed in gold letters. "Why me?" he asked quietly. "You must know hundreds of talented composers, people who've trained for this their whole lives." Helen glanced at the elderly woman, who had been watching this entire exchange with a knowing smile. "Because most of those composers are trying too hard to impress people. They're writing music to win awards or get tenure or prove how clever they are. But you? You were playing from somewhere real. I could hear it. Everyone in this lobby could hear it. That's rare." The elderly woman stepped forward then. "She's right, you know. I taught piano for 40 years at some very prestigious schools. I've heard thousands of pianists, but what you have is special. Don't let fear talk you out of this." David looked between the two women, feeling like the world had tilted sideways. Just 20 minutes ago, He'd been playing his usual set, thinking about what he'd make for dinner later, counting down the hours until he could go home. Now a symphony conductor was asking him to perform at a gala concert, and apparently he'd had a legendary piano teacher sitting in his audience without even knowing it. "I don't know," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is all happening so fast." "The best things usually do," Helen said. She tapped the business card still sitting on the piano. "Think about it. Call me in the next 3 days. If you say yes, we'll make it work. If you say no, I'll respect that. But David?" She leaned in slightly. "Don't say no because you're scared. Say no only if you genuinely don't want to do it." With that, Helen nodded to both him and the elderly woman, then turned and walked toward the elevators. David watched her go, his mind completely blank. The elderly woman patted his hand gently. "My name is Margaret, by the way," she said warmly. "And I wasn't lying about teaching for 40 years. I know talent when I hear it." "You have a gift, David. The question is, are you brave enough to share it?" Before David could respond, Margaret smiled and walked away, leaving him alone at the piano with Helen's business card and a head full of impossible thoughts. The rest of his shift passed in a blur. David played his usual songs, but his heart wasn't in it. His mind kept replaying the conversation, Helen's words echoing in his head, the National Symphony Orchestra, a gala concert, his music performed by professional musicians for hundreds of people. It was insane. It was terrifying. It was everything he'd given up dreaming about years ago. When his shift finally ended at 10 o'clock, David packed up his things in a daze. The night manager called out a good night, but David barely heard him. He walked out into the cool October air, Helen's business card tucked safely in his jacket pocket, feeling like he was standing at the edge of a cliff. He could walk away, go home, forget this ever happened, show up for his next shift, and keep playing background music for the rest of his life. It would be safe, comfortable, no risk of failure or disappointment, or he could jump. That night, David barely slept. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind refusing to shut down. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Helen's face, heard Margaret's words about being brave enough to share his gift. Around 3 in the morning, he gave up on sleep and got out of bed. He walked to his closet and pulled out the boxes he hadn't touched in years. Inside were notebooks filled with his compositions, some dating back 15 years or more. He'd written them in coffee shops and on lunch breaks, in the middle of the night when inspiration struck, during the hopeful years when he still thought he might make something of himself as a composer. David carried the notebooks to his small upright piano in the corner of his living room. He opened the first one and started to play. The melody was rough, unpolished, but there was something there, something real. He moved to the next composition, then the next, his fingers relearning pieces he'd written and forgotten. As the sun began to rise, David sat surrounded by 17 notebooks, his head full of music he'd buried but never truly forgotten. And for the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him that he'd thought was long dead. Hope. David called the hotel at 7 in the morning and told them he was sick. It was the first time in 3 years he'd called out of work, and his manager sounded genuinely concerned. David felt a small twinge of guilt, but not enough to change his mind. He needed time to think, time to remember who he used to be. He spent the entire day at his piano working through the notebooks. Some of the pieces made him cringe. They were overly complicated, trying too hard to sound impressive. Others were too simple, just fragments of ideas that never quite came together. But a few, maybe 4 or 5, had something special. They spoke to him across the years, reminding him of the person he'd been when he wrote them. There was the garden piece he'd played for Helen. That one was definitely his strongest work. Then there was a composition he'd written during a rainstorm, trying to capture the rhythm of water on windows and the feeling of being warm and safe inside while the world raged outside. Another piece had been inspired by his grandmother's stories about immigrating to America, the blend of sadness and hope she carried in her voice. Each one had a memory attached, a piece of his life embedded in the notes. By the time evening came, David was exhausted, but energized in a way he hadn't felt in years. His neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, knocked on his door around 7. She was a retired music teacher, maybe 70 years old, who'd lived next door for as long as David had been in the building. She'd heard him playing all day through the thin walls. "David, honey, what's going on?" she asked when he opened the door. "I haven't heard you play like that in years. Is everything okay?" David invited her in and told her everything. About Helen, about the offer to perform with the symphony, about the 2 weeks he had to prepare. Mrs. Patterson listened intently, her eyes growing wider with each detail. "Oh my goodness," she said when he finished. "David, this is incredible. Why do you look so terrified?" "Because it is terrifying," David admitted. "What if I fail? What if I get up there and freeze? What if my music isn't actually good and I've just been fooling myself all these years?" Mrs. Patterson shook her head firmly. "First of all, I've been listening to you play for 5 years through these walls. Your music is good. Really good. Second, you're not fooling yourself. That conductor heard something real. You need to trust that." "I don't know if I can do this," David said quietly. "Then let me help you," Mrs. Patterson offered. "I taught music theory for 35 years. Let me look at your compositions. We can work together to choose the best ones and polish them up. You don't have to do this alone." David felt something tight in his chest start to loosen. He wasn't alone. He had help. Maybe this wasn't completely insane after all. They spent the next 2 hours going through his notebooks together. Mrs. Patterson would play through a piece, stop, make notes, ask him questions about what he was trying to express. She was tough but fair, pointing out sections that needed work while praising the parts that really shone. By the end of the night, they'd narrowed it down to 4 compositions that could work for the concert. "Now you need to call that conductor," Mrs. Patterson said as she was leaving. "Don't wait. If you wait, fear will talk you out of it." David knew she was right. He pulled out Helen's business card and stared at it for a long moment. His finger hovered over his phone. Finally, before he could change his mind, he dialed the number. Helen answered on the second ring. "This is Helen." "Hi, it's David, from the hotel. The piano player." He winced at how awkward he sounded. "David, I was hoping you'd call. Have you made a decision?" David took a deep breath. "Yes, I want to do it. I'm terrified, but I want to try." He could hear the smile in Helen's voice. "Good. That's exactly the right answer. Fear means you care. Fear means it matters." "Can you meet me tomorrow at the concert hall? We need to get started right away." The next morning, David stood in front of the Riverside Concert Hall, trying not to throw up. The building was massive and imposing, all glass and modern architecture. He'd walked past it hundreds of times, but never imagined he'd actually perform there. Helen met him at the entrance and led him inside. The theater was breathtaking. Rows and rows of red velvet seats stretched back into the shadows, and the stage looked enormous. In the center sat a beautiful grand piano that probably cost more than David's car. The acoustics were incredible. Every footstep echoed through the space. "This is where you'll perform," Helen said, gesturing to the stage. 2,000 seats. It'll be completely full." David felt dizzy. 2,000 people. He'd gotten nervous playing for the handful of guests in the hotel lobby. How was he supposed to perform for 2,000 people? Helen must have seen the panic on his face because she put a hand on his shoulder. "David, listen to me. You're not playing for 2,000 people. You're playing for the music. You're sharing something that matters to you. The audience is just there to receive it. Focus on that." She introduced him to two arrangers from the orchestra, a man named Robert and a woman named Lynn. They were both younger than David expected, maybe in their 30s, and they treated his compositions with genuine respect and interest. They asked him questions about each piece, about what instruments he imagined, what feeling he wanted to create. Then they got to work figuring out how to transform his piano compositions into full orchestral arrangements. The process was fascinating and overwhelming. David had never seen his music written out for multiple instruments before. Hearing Robert and Lynn discuss which section would work for strings, which melody line the woodwinds should carry, whether the brass should come in during the climax, it made his music feel real in a way it never had before. Over the next few days, David fell into an intense routine. He'd go to the concert hall every morning and work with Robert and Lynn. They'd refine the arrangements, and David would play through sections on the piano while they made notes and adjustments. In the afternoons, he'd rehearse his parts, getting comfortable with the grand piano and the acoustics of the hall. Mrs. Patterson would come by in the evenings to listen and offer suggestions. Helen stopped by daily to check on their progress. On the fourth day, she brought some of the orchestra musicians to hear what they were working on. David played through the garden piece while Robert and Lynn explained the arrangement. When he finished, the musicians started asking questions, offering ideas, getting excited about the project. A violinist named Claire said the melody reminded her of her childhood. A cellist named Tom suggested a variation that made the piece even more emotional. David realized these weren't just professional musicians doing a job. They were connecting with his music. They cared about it. "This is really special," Claire told him during a break. "We play a lot of beautiful music, but there's something different about this. It feels personal, honest, like you're letting us into your heart." David didn't know what to say. He'd spent so long thinking his music didn't matter, that he was just a failed pianist playing background music in a hotel. But here were talented, accomplished musicians telling him his work had value, that it moved them. The concert was being promoted as featuring a special surprise performance. The symphony's marketing team was generating buzz without revealing who would be performing or what they'd play. The mystery was driving ticket sales, and the event had sold out within days. Helen told David that critics from major newspapers were planning to attend, along with donors who'd paid thousands of dollars for their seats. "No pressure," David joked weakly. "Actually, all the pressure," Helen replied with a slight smile. "But you can handle it. I wouldn't have asked you if I didn't believe that." A week before the concert, the full orchestra gathered for their first complete run-through with David. He stood backstage, listening to them warm up, and felt like he might pass out. 60 professional musicians, all gathered to play his music. Music he'd written in coffee shops and small apartments, never imagining anyone else would hear it. Helen called him onto the stage, and suddenly he was standing in front of the orchestra, all those talented people looking at him with expectation. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his sheet music. "Whenever you're ready," Helen said from the conductor's podium, her baton raised. David sat at the piano, placed his hands on the keys, and took a deep breath. Then he began to play the garden piece, and the orchestra came in behind him. The sound was overwhelming, beautiful, more than he'd ever imagined. His simple melody had become something magnificent, filled with layers and depth and emotion that made his eyes sting with tears. When they finished the piece, David sat frozen at the piano, overwhelmed by what he'd just experienced. The orchestra was silent for a moment. Then someone started clapping, and suddenly all 60 musicians were applauding. For him. For his music. Helen walked over to the piano, and David saw that she had tears in her eyes too. "That," she said softly, "is why I asked you to do this. That's what music is supposed to feel like." David realized in that moment that he'd made the right choice. No matter what happened at the actual concert, no matter if he succeeded or failed, this experience was already worth it. He'd remembered what it felt like to create something that mattered, to share a piece of his soul and have people receive it with open hearts. But the real test was still coming. In 1 week, he'd have to do this in front of 2,000 people. The thought still terrified him. But now, for the first time, he also felt ready. The week leading up to the concert felt like the longest and shortest week of David's life. Every day was packed with rehearsals, and every night he'd lie awake worrying about all the things that could go wrong. What if he hit a wrong note? What if his hands cramped up? What if the audience hated his music and walked out? Mrs. Patterson kept telling him to stop catastrophizing, but that was easier said than done. David had spent 3 years playing music that nobody really listened to. Now he was about to perform for an audience that would be analyzing his every move, every note. Critics would be writing reviews. Important people would be judging whether his music was worth their time and money. The orchestra rehearsed all 4 of his pieces until they could play them in their sleep. The garden composition was first, followed by the rainstorm piece, then his grandmother's journey, and finally a shorter work he'd written about late-night city streets. Each piece was about 6 to 8 minutes long, making his portion of the concert roughly 30 minutes total. Helen had structured the program so David's performance would come in the second half, after intermission. The audience would be warmed up, settled in, ready for something different. "Trust me, this is the best spot," Helen explained during one of their final rehearsals. "You want people to be comfortable but still alert. The second half opener is prime real estate." 3 days before the concert, David had to tell his manager at the hotel what was happening. He couldn't keep calling in sick, and he needed the night of the concert off. His manager, a practical man named Gerald, who rarely showed much emotion, listened to the whole story with a skeptical expression. "So let me get this straight," Gerald said when David finished. "A famous conductor heard you play here, and now you're performing with a symphony orchestra?" "I know it sounds crazy," David admitted. Gerald was quiet for a moment, then shook his head slowly. "David, I've had you playing piano in my lobby for 3 years. I always thought you were too good for this job, but you seemed happy enough so I didn't say anything. I'm glad someone finally noticed what you can do. Take the night off. Take the whole week off if you need it." David was stunned. "Really?" "Really. Just promise me one thing. When you're famous and playing in concert halls all over the world, remember us little people." Gerald was smiling, and David realized his boss had actually been paying attention all along. The day before the concert, Helen called an extra rehearsal, not for David's music, but just for him. She wanted him to practice walking onto the stage, bowing to the audience, sitting at the piano, and going through the motions without the pressure of actually performing. "Muscle memory," she explained. "Tomorrow night, your nerves are going to be screaming at you. But if your body knows exactly what to do, it'll carry you through the scary parts." They practiced it a dozen times, walking from the wings to center stage, bowing to the audience, not too deep, not too shallow, walking to the piano, adjusting the bench, taking a breath, nodding to Helen to show he was ready, then beginning to play. "Good," Helen said after the 12th run-through. "Now tomorrow, no matter how nervous you are, your body will remember these steps. You'll move on autopilot until your hands hit the keys, and once you start playing, the music will take over. You just have to get yourself to that first note." That night, David couldn't eat dinner. His stomach was in knots. Mrs. Patterson came over with chamomile tea and homemade cookies, trying to calm him down. "I've been to hundreds of concerts in my life," she said, sitting on his worn couch. "You know what the best ones all had in common? The performer cared. They weren't just going through the motions or showing off their technical skills. They were sharing something real. That's what you're going to do tomorrow." "What if I mess up?" David asked for the 100th time. "Then you mess up," Mrs. Patterson said simply. "You're human. Humans make mistakes. But David, you've worked so hard for this. You've prepared as much as anyone could. Now you just have to trust yourself. Trust your music. Trust that garden you put into those notes all those years ago." David tried to sleep that night, but managed maybe 3 hours total. He kept jolting awake in a panic, convinced he'd forgotten how to play or that his alarm wouldn't go off. Finally, around 5 in the morning, he gave up and got out of bed. He made coffee and sat at his small upright piano, playing through the pieces one last time. His hands knew what to do. The music was there, buried in his fingers and his heart. He just had to let it out. The concert was scheduled for 7:30 that evening. David arrived at the concert hall at 3, even though Helen had told him to come at 5. He couldn't stay in his apartment any longer. He needed to be in the space, to feel the stage under his feet, to prepare himself mentally for what was about to happen. The theater was buzzing with activity. Stage crew members were adjusting lights and checking sound equipment. Orchestra musicians were arriving early to warm up. Helen found David standing in the wings, staring out at the empty seats. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Terrified, excited, like I might throw up." "All of the above." Helen smiled. "Perfect. That's exactly how you should feel. If you weren't nervous, I'd be worried. The nerves mean you care. Use them. Let them sharpen your focus." As the afternoon wore on, the theater began to transform. Ushers arrived in their formal uniforms, the lobby filled with flowers and programs. The bar opened for pre-show drinks. David watched from backstage as the first audience members began to arrive around 6:30, dressed in elegant gowns and suits. These were people who took music seriously, people who knew quality when they heard it. Robert, one of the arrangers, found David pacing nervously in the green room. "Hey, I just wanted to tell you something before the show starts. Working on your music this past week has been one of the highlights of my career. I've arranged hundreds of pieces." "But there was something different about yours. It reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. No matter what happens tonight, that matters." David felt his eyes getting wet and blinked hard. "Thank you. That means more than you know." The orchestra members began gathering backstage, dressed in their formal concert blacks. Claire, the violinist who'd connected with the garden piece, gave David a thumbs up. Tom, the cellist, squeezed his shoulder encouragingly. These talented musicians believed in his music. They'd worked hard to bring it to life. David owed it to them to give his best performance. At 7:15, Helen gathered everyone for a final word before the concert began. "I just want to thank you all for your beautiful work on this program. Tonight is special. We're not just performing music, we're telling stories. We're sharing human experiences. David, your courage in sharing your compositions with us is inspiring. Now let's share them with the world." The lights in the theater dimmed. The audience hushed. The first half of the concert began with a Beethoven symphony, giving David another hour to prepare mentally. He could hear the music filtering backstage, the orchestra playing with precision and passion. The audience applauded enthusiastically at the end of the first half. Then came intermission. 15 minutes for the audience to stretch, grab drinks, chat with friends. 15 minutes for David to completely fall apart or pull himself together. He chose the latter, barely. Helen found him backstage doing breathing exercises Mrs. Patterson had taught him. 5 minutes, are you ready?" "No, yes." "I don't know." "David, look at me." Helen's voice was firm but kind. "You've already done the hard part. You created beautiful music. You worked hard to prepare it. You showed up. Now all you have to do is play, just like you did in that hotel lobby, just like you did for Margaret. Remember who you're playing for, not the critics, not the donors. Play for your mother's garden. Play for that person sitting in the audience who needs to hear something real tonight." The house lights flashed, signaling the end of intermission. The audience returned to their seats. 2,000 people, all settling in, programs rustling, conversations dying down. David stood in the wings, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. The orchestra filed onto the stage to warm applause. They took their seats, adjusted their music stands, prepared their instruments. Helen walked to the conductor's podium. The audience applauded for her, then fell silent. Helen turned and nodded to David. This was it, the moment that would change everything or nothing. The moment he'd been dreading and dreaming about. There was no backing out now. David stepped out from the wings onto the stage, and the lights hit him like a physical force. The audience was a dark mass beyond the bright stage lights, 2,000 faces he couldn't quite see. He walked to center stage, his legs somehow carrying him forward even though they felt like they might give out. He bowed, just like they'd practiced. The audience applauded politely, curious about this unknown performer. David straightened up and looked out at all those people. He saw Margaret sitting in the fourth row, smiling up at him with encouragement. He saw Mrs. Patterson a few rows back, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. He saw Gerald from the hotel, who'd apparently come to support him. David walked to the piano and sat down. He adjusted the bench. He placed his hands on the keys and took a deep breath. He looked up at Helen, who had her baton raised, waiting for his signal. In that moment, all the fear drained away. David nodded to Helen. She smiled and gave him one final encouraging look. Then she lifted her baton, and David began to play. The first notes floated out into the silent theater, delicate and pure. David's fingers found the melody he'd written 15 years ago, the one inspired by his mother's garden. For a moment, it was just him and the piano, alone in the world. Then the orchestra came in behind him, the strings swelling like a gentle breeze, and suddenly his simple composition became something he barely recognized, something bigger than himself. David forgot about the audience. He forgot about the critics and the donors and the 2,000 pairs of eyes watching him. All that existed was the music and the memory of his mother kneeling in the dirt, her hands covered in soil, smiling as she planted tulip bulbs. He played for her, for the garden she'd loved, for all the beauty she'd brought into his life. The piece built slowly, carefully, moving from gentle spring mornings to the full bloom of summer. The woodwinds carried the middle section, their bright tones like birdsong. The brass came in for the climax, powerful but not overwhelming, like sunshine breaking through clouds. And through it all, David's piano wove the central melody, the heart of everything. When the final notes faded away, there was a moment of complete silence. David's hands were still on the keys, his eyes closed, lost in the memory. He'd played it perfectly. Not technically perfect, maybe, but emotionally perfect. He'd given everything he had. Then the applause started. It began as a ripple and grew into a wave, rolling through the theater like thunder. David opened his eyes, startled back to reality. The audience was clapping enthusiastically, and he could see people in the front rows wiping their eyes. Margaret was on her feet, and others were starting to stand too. Helen turned from the conductor's podium and smiled at him, her eyes shining. She gestured for him to stand and acknowledge the applause. David rose from the piano bench on shaky legs and bowed. The applause grew even louder. But there was no time to process what had just happened. They had 3 more pieces to perform. David sat back down, and Helen raised her baton again. The rainstorm piece began, and David threw himself into it with renewed confidence. The first piece had worked. The audience was with him. Now he could really let go. The rainstorm composition was more playful, capturing the rhythm of water and wind, the coziness of being inside while nature raged outside. David's fingers danced across the keys, and the orchestra matched his energy perfectly. They'd rehearsed this so many times that they moved as one, anticipating each other's musical choices. Next came his grandmother's piece, the one about immigration and hope and carrying your past into your future. This one was more complex emotionally, moving between melancholy and optimism. David had woven in a traditional melody his grandmother used to hum, transforming it into something new while honoring its roots. When the strings played that old, familiar tune, he heard someone in the audience gasp softly. The final piece, the city streets composition, was the most modern of his works. It had an edge to it, a restless energy that captured the feeling of walking through downtown at midnight, watching the world move around you. The percussion drove the piece forward, while the piano provided moments of reflection between the chaos. When the last note echoed through the theater and faded into silence, David was exhausted. He'd poured 30 years of suppressed creativity into 30 minutes of music. He'd shared parts of himself he'd kept hidden for so long. He felt raw and vulnerable and completely alive. The audience erupted. This time, it wasn't just applause. It was a standing ovation, all 2,000 people on their feet, clapping and cheering. David stood at the piano, overwhelmed, barely able to process what was happening. Helen was applauding too, along with the entire orchestra. Claire, the violinist, had tears streaming down her face. Helen gestured for David to take another bow. He did, and the applause somehow grew even louder. People were shouting, "Bravo!" The ovation went on and on. David counted in his head. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. They were still clapping, still standing. Helen walked over to the piano and took David's hand, raising it high. She was giving him credit, making sure the audience knew this was his music, his creation. The gesture made David's throat tight with emotion. 4 minutes. 5 minutes. The applause showed no signs of stopping. Finally, after what felt like forever, the audience began to sit down. The applause faded to a warm murmur, then to silence. Helen led David off the stage for intermission, and the moment they were in the wings, David's knees buckled. Robert caught him, laughing. "That was incredible," Robert said. "Did you hear them? 7 minutes of applause. I've never seen anything like it." Mrs. Patterson rushed backstage, not caring that she wasn't supposed to be there. She threw her arms around David, crying openly. "I'm so proud of you. Your mother would be so proud of you." Margaret appeared next, moving through the backstage chaos with the ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime in theaters. "I told you," she said simply. "I told you that you had something special. Thank goodness you were brave enough to share it." The rest of the concert passed in a blur. The orchestra performed another symphony for the second half, but David couldn't focus on it. He sat in the green room, trying to process what had just happened. Critics were already typing reviews on their phones. Donors were talking about this unknown pianist who'd come out of nowhere. The symphony's social media was blowing up with posts from audience members. After the concert ended, Helen found David and brought him to a small reception for major donors. Normally, he would have been terrified of walking into a room full of wealthy, important people. But after what he'd just experienced, he felt different, lighter, more confident. He'd shared his truth with 2,000 people, and they'd received it. What could be scarier than that? People surrounded him immediately, wanting to shake his hand, to tell him how his music had moved them. A woman in an elegant dress said the garden piece had reminded her of her late father, who'd been a botanist. A man in an expensive suit said the grandmother composition had made him think of his own family's immigration story. Over and over, people told him that his music had touched something real in them. A distinguished-looking man in his 60s introduced himself as the director of a major music festival. "I'd like to commission a new piece from you for our summer festival. We can discuss details, but I want you to know that what you did tonight is exactly what classical music needs. Authenticity, emotion, story." David just nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. The reviews started appearing online within hours. The major newspaper's classical music critic, a notoriously tough reviewer, wrote about a revelation in contemporary composition and praised David's raw, emotional honesty that transcends technical considerations. Another critic called his performance the most moving new music in years and predicted that David would become an important voice in modern classical composition. By the next morning, the symphony's recording of the concert was being shared widely. Music blogs were writing about the mysterious hotel pianist who'd stunned a gala audience. Orchestras from other cities were reaching out, asking if David would be interested in performing his compositions with them. David's phone wouldn't stop ringing. His email inbox was flooded. The hotel called to congratulate him, and Gerald mentioned that they'd been getting calls from reporters asking about him. The whole situation felt surreal. But the moment that mattered most to David came 3 days after the concert. He was back at his apartment trying to make sense of all the offers and opportunities coming his way, when there was a knock at his door. It was Margaret, the woman who'd started everything by asking him to play something from his heart. She handed him an envelope. "I wanted to give you this in person," she said. Inside was a handwritten letter. Margaret explained that she'd taught hundreds of students over her 40 years at prestigious music schools. Many had gone on to successful careers. But few had what David possessed: the ability to make people feel something real through music. She wrote that technical perfection was teachable, but authenticity was rare and precious. She thanked him for reminding her why she'd devoted her life to music in the first place. At the bottom of the letter, she'd written, "Sometimes all we need is one person to truly listen before we can remember how to believe in ourselves again. Thank you for letting me be that person for you. But remember, the music was always there. You just needed permission to share it." David read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and put it in his desk drawer next to the notebooks of compositions. He sat at his small upright piano and played a few notes of the Garden piece. It sounded different now. Not better or worse, just different. Like it had grown beyond him, taken on a life of its own. 3 months later, David's compositions were being performed by orchestras across the country. He'd signed with a music publisher. He was working on new pieces and getting commissions from prestigious festivals. Music schools were inviting him to do workshops about authentic composition, but he never forgot where it started. Every Thursday evening, if his schedule allowed, David would go back to the downtown Grand Hotel. He'd sit in the lobby, not at the piano anymore, but on one of the velvet sofas. He'd listen to the new pianist play background music for guests who weren't really listening. And sometimes, if he saw someone who looked like they needed it, he'd make a request. "Would you play something of your own? Something from your heart?" Because David had learned something important that October evening when he'd played a simple tune for a woman who truly listened. He'd learned that dreams don't die. They just wait. They wait for the right moment, the right person, the right opportunity to remind us who we really are. And sometimes, all it takes is one person believing in you before you can start believing in yourself again. One person willing to listen before you can find the courage to share your voice. One simple tune that opens the door to everything you thought you'd lost. David's story wasn't about becoming famous or successful, though those things happened. It was about remembering that the things we create from our hearts matter, that sharing our truth, no matter how scary, is worth the risk, and that it's never too late to become who we were always meant to be. The music had always been there, waiting inside him. He'd just needed permission to let it out. And now, sitting in that hotel lobby on Thursday evenings, David tried to give other people that same permission, that same moment of recognition and encouragement that had changed his life. Because that's what art does. It connects us. It reminds us we're not alone. And sometimes, just sometimes, it gives us the courage to share the parts of ourselves we thought nobody wanted to hear.